Looking back, I never imagined my life would take such a drastic turn because of something as mundane as a security camera. But then again, isn't that how these things always go? You make a decision that seems small, insignificant, even, and before you know it, it's changed everything. My name is Eric, and I'm a 38-year-old software engineer. Technology has always been my passion, so when I decided to install security cameras in our home, it felt like a natural step. It wasn't because I didn't feel safe, our suburban neighborhood was as quiet and predictable as you'd expect. But I liked the idea of having a little extra security. Plus, I enjoyed tinkering with new gadgets, and this seemed like a fun weekend project. My wife, Sarah, wasn't as enthusiastic about the idea. She's 36 and works as a real estate agent, always on the go and juggling a schedule that's packed with showings, client meetings, and open houses. She rolled her eyes when I told her about my plans, but she didn't outright object. "Just don't turn the house into a tech lab," she joked, giving me a quick kiss before heading out the door. Sarah and I had been married for 12 years. On the surface, we were the picture of a happy, successful couple. We had a beautiful home, careers we were proud of, and enough disposable income to enjoy life without constantly worrying about bills. Sure, we had our share of disagreements, what couple doesn't, but I thought we were solid. At least, that's what I told myself. Over the past few months, I'd noticed a subtle shift in Sarah. She seemed more distracted, more irritable. Her phone was always within arm's reach, and she'd started taking calls in the other room, something she'd never done before. When I asked about it, she brushed it off, saying it was just work-related stress. "The market's crazy right now," she'd say, forcing a smile. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But there was something about the way she avoided my eyes when she said it, the way her laugh felt just a little too forced, that left me unsettled. The decision to install the cameras wasn't about her, not at first. I told myself it was purely for practical reasons, extra security, peace of mind, and a bit of fun with a new tech project. I set up cameras in the front and backyards, the living room, and the kitchen. Sarah gave me a skeptical look when she saw me fiddling with the placement of the one in the kitchen, but she didn't say anything. "That's a weird angle," she finally said, watching me adjust it. "It covers more of the room this way," I replied, shrugging. She didn't press further, and I didn't think much of it at the time. For a while, the cameras became just another part of the house. I'd occasionally check the footage, mostly out of curiosity or to test the system, but nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. Life carried on as usual, until it didn't. I didn't know it yet, but those cameras were about to reveal something that would turn my world upside down. It started subtly, so subtly that I might have missed it if I hadn't already felt the growing distance between Sarah and me. At first, it was little things, her late nights at work becoming more frequent, her responses to my questions growing shorter and more evasive. Long day. I'd ask when she came home well after dinner, her heels clicking on the tile as she set her bag down by the door. "Yeah," she'd reply, barely glancing my way before disappearing upstairs to shower off the stress. I told myself not to overthink it. Real estate is a demanding career, and Sarah's been nothing if not dedicated to her work. But the unease gnawed at me, no matter how much I tried to ignore it. One evening, after Sarah had rushed out the door for another last-minute client meeting, I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone. On a whim, I opened the app connected to our security cameras. I hadn't checked them in weeks, there hadn't been any reason to, but curiosity got the better of me. The footage was uneventful at first, a squirrel darting across the backyard, shadows shifting as the sun dipped below the horizon, the living room empty except for the faint hum of the television I'd left on earlier. But then something caught my eye. In the kitchen, Sarah appeared on the feed, her back to the camera as she leaned against the counter. She was holding her phone, speaking animatedly to someone on the other end. That wasn't unusual in itself, but her body language was different, relaxed in a way that felt too intimate, her voice carrying a tone I couldn't quite place. I turned up the volume on my phone, straining to catch fragments of the conversation. Most of it was muffled, but I heard her laugh, a soft, almost flirtatious sound I hadn't heard in months. My stomach tightened. Who was she talking to? The footage didn't provide any answers, and when I confronted her later that evening, she brushed it off as a call with a difficult client. "They're buying a house sight unseen," she explained, rolling her eyes. I had to convince them the kitchen was worth the asking price. Her tone was light, but the explanation felt flimsy, like she'd rehearsed it in her head before saying it aloud. I let it go, not because I believed her, but because I didn't know what else to do. A few days later, I decided to review more footage, not out of suspicion, I told myself, but out of curiosity. What I found was nothing concrete, just more small moments that didn't sit right. Sarah taking a call and quickly stepping out of the camera's view. A delivery arriving that she rushed to grab, checking the street as if making sure no one saw. Then, one evening, I saw it, a man I didn't recognize entering our house. The footage showed Sarah opening the front door and letting him in, her smile wide and warm. He was tall, with a casual confidence that made my chest tighten. They walked into the kitchen together, and though nothing overtly inappropriate happened, there was something about the way she leaned toward him, the way her laughter filled the room, that felt like a slap in the face. I paused the footage, staring at the frozen image of the two of them. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Who was he? And why did it feel like he wasn't just a friend or client, as Sarah might have claimed? In that moment, the cameras stopped being about security. They became my window into a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to see. The image of Sarah and the unknown man lingered in my mind like an unanswered question. I couldn't shake it, no matter how much I tried to convince myself it might be innocent. Sure, I hadn't seen anything explicitly damning, but the way they interacted, the way her body language softened, the way she smiled so easily, didn't sit right. Who was he? And why was she so at ease with him? The footage didn't provide any clues. It didn't capture sound beyond faint muffled noises, and the angle of the camera in the kitchen wasn't ideal. If anything more had happened, it was beyond the camera's view. I decided to adjust the placement of the camera the next day under the guise of improving coverage. Sarah didn't even question it. She was too busy rushing out the door for another meeting. "Late showing tonight?" I asked as she slipped on her heels. "Yeah," she replied, her tone distracted. "It might run late, so don't wait up." She kissed me on the cheek, but it felt perfunctory, like she was checking off a box. After she left, I reviewed the footage again, hoping to find some detail I might have missed. But beyond the initial interaction, the rest of the footage showed them simply talking in the kitchen before the man left about an hour later. Still, the way she had hugged him at the door, quick but deliberate, made my stomach churn. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. I adjusted the camera in the kitchen to cover more of the space, making it less likely that anything would escape its view. Then, I reviewed other camera feeds from that day to see if I could track when the man had arrived and left. The front yard camera showed him pulling up in a silver sedan about 10 minutes before Sarah let him in. He parked down the street, which struck me as odd. Why wouldn't he park in the driveway? Something about it felt deliberate, like he didn't want anyone to see his car. When Sarah returned home that evening, I tried to act normal. She seemed relaxed, almost carefree, but it only added to my suspicion. "How was your showing?" I asked casually as she sat on the couch. "It went well," she said, smiling faintly. "They're thinking about making an offer." Her response was so smooth, so automatic, that it only deepened my unease. Later that night, when she went to bed, I stayed up, scrolling through her social media accounts and looking for anything that might connect her to the man in the footage. But there was nothing, no photos, no comments, no hints of who he might be. The following day, Sarah left again for a client meeting, and I decided to monitor the cameras in real time. I sat at my desk with the live feed pulled up on my second monitor, my heart pounding every time someone walked by the house. Then, just as I was beginning to think I was overreacting, I saw it, the silver sedan pulling up to the curb again. The man stepped out, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt, and walked up to the house. Sarah opened the door before he even knocked, as if she'd been waiting for him. My chest tightened as I watched them enter the kitchen, their voices inaudible but their expressions unmistakable. They were comfortable with each other in a way that made my blood run cold. This time, they lingered in the kitchen longer. I watched as Sarah poured them both glasses of wine and leaned against the counter, laughing at something he said. Then, as if on cue, they stepped out of the camera's view entirely. I stared at the screen, my pulse racing, knowing that whatever was happening now, I wasn't seeing it. My mind filled in the blanks with every worst-case scenario imaginable. The minutes stretched on, and when they finally came back into view, Sarah was adjusting her blouse, and he looked far too at ease. As he left, she followed him to the door, the same quick hug as before, but this time I noticed the way her hand lingered on his arm. I closed the app, my hands trembling. Whatever I had hoped to find, or not find, this wasn't it. I wasn't just imagining things. Something was going on, and I wasn't sure I could handle the truth. The next few days were some of the hardest I've ever experienced. The image of Sarah and that man lingered in my mind, a constant reminder that my marriage wasn't as solid as I'd believed. Every interaction with her felt strained, my suspicion coloring every word, every glance. I couldn't bring myself to confront her yet. A part of me still clung to the hope that there was an innocent explanation, that I was somehow misinterpreting what I'd seen. But the logical part of me knew better. One evening, after Sarah left for another showing, I decided to check the footage again. By now, the cameras had become more than just tools for security, they were my only window into the truth. Sure enough, within minutes of her leaving, the silver sedan pulled up to the house. This time, I watched in real time as the man approached the door. Sarah greeted him with a warm smile, and they disappeared into the kitchen. The adjusted camera placement gave me a clearer view than before. I watched as she poured him a drink, her body language relaxed and familiar. They talked for a while, but then things took a turn I hadn't been prepared for. He leaned toward her, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she laughed softly, placing her hand on his arm in a way that was undeniably intimate. Then it happened. He kissed her. I felt my stomach drop as I watched the moment unfold on the screen. She didn't resist. In fact, she leaned into it, her hands finding their way to his shoulders as the kiss deepened. I paused the footage, staring at the frozen image of my wife in the arms of another man. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. This wasn't just my imagination. This wasn't some harmless misunderstanding or innocent friendship. This was real. I rewound the footage, hoping, praying, that I'd somehow misinterpreted what I'd seen. But no matter how many times I watched it, the reality was undeniable. My wife was having an affair. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I barely registered the sound of the front door opening or Sarah's cheerful voice as she announced her return. I couldn't look at her, couldn't speak to her. "Everything okay?" she asked, noticing my distant demeanor. "Yeah," I replied, my voice strained. "Just tired." She didn't press further, which only made me angrier. How could she act so normal, so casual, when she'd just come back from seeing another man? That night, as she slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't keep this bottled up forever. Sooner or later, I'd have to confront her, to demand answers. But for now, I needed time to process what I'd seen, to figure out how to navigate the fallout of a betrayal I never saw coming. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. My marriage, my trust, my sense of security, it had all been shattered in an instant. And yet, despite the pain, I knew one thing for certain: I deserved to know the whole story, no matter how much it hurt. The following morning, I woke up with a sense of dread weighing heavily on my chest. I'd spent most of the night replaying the footage in my mind, questioning how I had missed the signs and how long this had been going on. The thought of confronting Sarah filled me with equal parts anger and heartbreak, but I knew it had to be done. She was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, sipping her morning coffee and scrolling through her phone. She looked so calm, so normal, that for a moment, I hesitated. But then the memory of her with that man flashed in my mind, and the anger rose like a tide I couldn't hold back. "We need to talk," I said, my voice tight. Sarah looked up, surprised by my tone. "Sure," she said, setting her mug down. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I know about him, Sarah. The man who's been coming here. I've seen the footage." Her face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks as she stared at me. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and the silence was deafening. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered finally, her voice unsteady. "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice rising. "I've seen everything, the hugs, the kisses, the times you told me you were working but were here with him. Don't insult me by pretending it didn't happen." Her mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came out. She looked away, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the counter. "Eric, she began, but I cut her off. "How long has this been going on?" I demanded. "How long have you been lying to me, sneaking around behind my back?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. "Not yet. It wasn't supposed to happen," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't plan this. It just happened." I let out a bitter laugh. "That's the excuse you're going with? It just happened. You had a choice, Sarah. Every time you let him into this house, every time you lied to me, you made a choice." She started crying then, tears streaming down her face as she tried to explain. "I've been so unhappy, Eric. I've felt so distant from you. You're always focused on work, on your gadgets, and I needed someone to talk to. Someone who listened." Her words stung, but I wasn't ready to let her off the hook. "So instead of coming to me, your husband, you decided to turn to someone else? To betray me in the worst possible way?" "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice breaking. I was confused. I didn't know how to tell you what I was feeling. "You didn't mean to hurt me?" I repeated, incredulous. "Sarah, you brought another man into our home, while I trusted you, while I thought we were building a life together. And now you're telling me you didn't mean to hurt me?" She collapsed into a chair, sobbing, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. The betrayal was too fresh, the wound too raw. "I need to know one thing," I said, my voice cold. "Is it over? Or is there more you're not telling me?" She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "It's over," she said. "I ended it. I swear." But the damage was already done. Even if she was telling the truth, the trust between us was shattered, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone with her tears. I needed space, time to think, and most importantly, to figure out what I was going to do next. Because one thing was clear, nothing about our marriage would ever be the same again. The days after the confrontation felt like moving through a fog. I was physically present but emotionally detached, going through the motions of daily life without really processing anything. Sarah and I barely spoke, and when we did, the conversations were strained and shallow. She tried to apologize more than once, but the words only deepened my sense of betrayal. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the footage in my mind like a never-ending loop. The way she smiled at him, the way she let him kiss her, it haunted me. Every detail felt like a dagger to my heart, twisting deeper with each replay. The house felt different now, as though its warmth and familiarity had been stripped away. The kitchen, where I had seen them together, felt tainted. Even our bedroom seemed like a hollow shell of what it once was. Sarah tried to act normal, cooking dinner, cleaning the house, and going about her routine as if nothing had happened. But I saw the cracks in her facade. She was nervous, her movements tentative, her eyes darting toward me as if trying to gauge my mood. One evening, she sat across from me at the dinner table, her hands trembling as she pushed her food around on her plate. "Eric," she said softly, breaking the silence. "I know I hurt you, and I know I have no right to ask, but, can we talk?" I looked at her, my chest tightening. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, but I didn't have the energy. Instead, I shook my head. "I'm not ready," I said flatly. She nodded, her shoulders sagging with defeat. At work, I found it hard to concentrate. My mind constantly drifted back to what had happened, the images and emotions intruding at the worst moments. My colleagues noticed the change in me, but I brushed off their concern with excuses about being tired or stressed. In truth, I felt like I was unraveling. I spent hours online, reading articles and forums about infidelity, looking for some kind of clarity or reassurance. Some stories mirrored my own, filled with heartbreak and betrayal, while others offered glimpses of hope for reconciliation. But none of them had the answers I was looking for. One night, I found myself scrolling through the security footage again, searching for something, anything, that might explain why Sarah had done what she did. But the more I watched, the more hollow I felt. The person I saw on the screen wasn't the Sarah I thought I knew. She looked like her, smiled like her, but her actions were those of a stranger. I started avoiding her as much as possible. I'd leave early in the morning, go for long drives after work, and retreat to the spare bedroom at night. The silence between us grew heavier with each passing day, a chasm neither of us seemed willing, or able, to bridge. Lying in that cold, unfamiliar bed, I wrestled with a million questions. Could I ever forgive her? Did I even want to? Was our marriage worth saving, or was this the beginning of the end? Every time I thought about confronting her again, I felt a surge of anger mixed with despair. She had betrayed me in a way I never thought possible, and I wasn't sure if I could ever look at her the same way. In those quiet, solitary moments, I realized something painful but undeniable: I was no longer the same person I had been before the cameras. The betrayal had changed me, leaving scars I wasn't sure would ever fully heal. For now, I could only take it one day at a time, grappling with the weight of my emotions and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But deep down, I knew that a decision would have to be made soon. Whether it meant trying to rebuild our broken marriage or walking away from it altogether, something had to give. After days of icy silence, Sarah approached me one evening while I was in the living room, pretending to focus on a book I couldn't bring myself to read. She stood there for a moment, hesitating, before finally speaking. "Eric," she began, her voice shaky but determined, "I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back. But I don't want to lose us. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right, if you'll let me." I looked at her, studying her face for signs of sincerity. Her eyes were red from crying, her posture tense with uncertainty. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell her it was too late, but another part of me, one I wasn't proud of, wanted to believe her. "Whatever it takes?" I asked, my voice cold. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Anything. Counseling, therapy, whatever you need. I just want to fix this." The idea of counseling hadn't crossed my mind before, but her desperation made me pause. I thought about Liam, our family, and the years we had shared. Was I willing to throw it all away without trying? "Fine," I said finally, the words heavy on my tongue. "We'll try counseling. But don't mistake this for forgiveness. This is your last chance, Sarah. If I catch you lying to me again, we're done." She nodded quickly, relief washing over her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I won't let you down, Eric. I promise." The next day, Sarah booked a session with a marriage counselor, and a week later, we found ourselves sitting in a small, warmly lit office across from a therapist named Dr. Linton. "Why don't we start with why you're here?" Dr. Linton asked, her voice calm and non-judgmental. I spoke first, detailing the betrayal, the footage, and the fallout in blunt terms. Sarah sat quietly, tears running down her face as I recounted the events that had shattered our marriage. When it was her turn to speak, she took a deep breath. "I made a terrible mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "I felt distant from Eric, like we were living separate lives. And instead of addressing it with him, I sought comfort in someone else. I regret it more than I can put into words." Dr. Linton nodded thoughtfully. "Rebuilding trust after infidelity is one of the hardest challenges a marriage can face," she said. "It will require openness, vulnerability, and a willingness to work through the pain, both individually and together. Are you both committed to this process?" I hesitated before nodding. Sarah did the same, though her agreement came more quickly. Over the next few sessions, we worked through the layers of hurt and resentment that had built up between us. Sarah admitted to feeling neglected, citing my obsession with work and technology as a barrier in our relationship. While I didn't agree with her reasoning, I acknowledged that I hadn't been as present as I could have been. "I should have talked to you," Sarah said during one session, her voice thick with regret. "I should have told you how I was feeling instead of betraying you." Despite her apologies and the progress we seemed to be making in counseling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. I found myself replaying the footage in my mind, searching for clues I might have missed. One evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, I logged into the camera app again, scanning through recent footage. I told myself it was just a precaution, a way to ensure she was keeping her promise. What I found made my heart sink. It wasn't footage of the man visiting the house, at least, not this time. Instead, it was a clip of Sarah on the phone, her voice hushed as she spoke to someone in the kitchen. "I can't talk right now," she said, her tone urgent. "We're working on things. I'll call you later." I rewound the clip, listening to it again, my pulse quickening. She hadn't said a name, but the context was clear. She was still in contact with him. The fragile hope I had been clinging to shattered in an instant. Sarah hadn't been honest with me, not fully. Despite her promises, she was still keeping secrets. That night, as I lay in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, I realized that the reconciliation I had agreed to was nothing more than an illusion. The trust we were trying to rebuild was already crumbling, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to try again. I didn't sleep much after seeing that clip. The few fragile threads holding our reconciliation together were fraying, and I was stuck in a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and disappointment. Sarah's words from counseling replayed in my head, her promises to change, to be honest, and to rebuild what she'd destroyed. But the footage didn't lie. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to look at her. She chatted over breakfast as if nothing had happened, her tone light and her demeanor relaxed. It was almost insulting, knowing what I knew, seeing her pretend so effortlessly. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked, glancing at me over her coffee mug. I forced a nod, biting back the words I wanted to say. I couldn't confront her yet, not without fully understanding the scope of her lies. If she was still in contact with him, what else was she hiding? That evening, after Sarah went upstairs to shower, I returned to the camera app and scrolled through more footage. There wasn't much at first, just mundane moments of Sarah working, cleaning, and watching TV. But then, I found it. 2 nights earlier, after I'd gone to bed, she'd called him again. The footage showed her pacing in the kitchen, her voice low but audible enough to hear snippets of the conversation. "I told you I can't keep doing this," she said, sounding exasperated. "He's starting to trust me again, and I can't risk that." My chest tightened as I listened. Trust her again? Risk what? "I just need more time," she continued, pausing as if listening to his response. "I don't know. I'll figure something out. Her tone softened then, almost wistful. I miss you too. The conversation ended shortly after, and she turned off the kitchen lights, heading upstairs as if nothing had happened. I sat there, staring at the screen, my hands shaking. Any hope I had left for our marriage was gone. She wasn't just lying to me, she was actively manipulating me, using my willingness to try and reconcile as cover for whatever she was still doing with him. The next day, I went through the motions of work, barely able to focus on my tasks. My co-workers commented on how tired I looked, but I brushed them off with a half-hearted excuse about deadlines. When I got home that evening, Sarah greeted me with her usual smile, but this time, I couldn't bring myself to return it. "What's wrong?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "Nothing," I said quickly, avoiding her gaze. She didn't press, which only fueled my frustration. She wasn't even curious enough to dig deeper, too preoccupied with keeping her secrets. Later that night, I sat in the guest room, staring at the blank wall as a heavy realization settled over me. There was no fixing this. Sarah had made her choice, and no amount of counseling or promises could undo the damage she'd done. But before I confronted her again, I needed to prepare. I wasn't just walking away, I was ending this chapter of my life for good. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Contacting a lawyer was one of the hardest steps I'd ever taken, but it also felt like the first moment of clarity I'd had in weeks. As much as I wanted to cling to the life I thought we'd built, I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Sarah's choices had destroyed the foundation of our marriage, and there was no rebuilding from the wreckage. The lawyer, a calm and composed man named Mark, listened patiently as I explained the situation. I told him about the cameras, the footage, and the attempts at reconciliation that had failed spectacularly. "You've got concrete evidence," he said, nodding thoughtfully. "That will help during the proceedings, especially if custody or division of assets becomes contentious." Custody wasn't an issue, we didn't have kids, but the house, our finances, and everything we built together were another story. I couldn't imagine splitting up our life piece by piece, but I knew it was inevitable. Mark outlined the steps I needed to take, from gathering documentation to preparing for the official filing. "It's going to be emotionally taxing," he warned. "But it sounds like you've already made up your mind." I had. That evening, as I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the paperwork Mark had sent over, Sarah walked in. She paused when she saw me, her brow furrowing. "What's that?" she asked, gesturing toward the stack of papers. I looked up at her, my chest tightening. "It's divorce paperwork." Her face went pale, her eyes widening in shock. "Eric, no," she whispered, stepping closer. "We don't have to do this. We can work through this. Please, I'll do whatever it takes." I shook my head, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on me. "We already tried, Sarah. You said you ended it, but you didn't. I saw the footage. I heard your calls. You've been lying to me this entire time." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she sank into the chair across from me. "I was scared," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know how to stop. I didn't want to lose you, but I was afraid to let him go." Her words might have carried weight weeks ago, but now, they felt hollow. "You made your choice," I said firmly. "And now I'm making mine." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Eric, please," she begged. "I'll cut all contact with him. I'll prove it to you. Just give me one more chance." I stood, my hands shaking with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "I gave you a chance, Sarah. I gave you every opportunity to be honest, to fix this. But you kept lying. I can't do this anymore." Her sobs filled the room as I walked out, but I didn't look back. In the days that followed, the fallout of my decision became more apparent. Sarah moved out of the house temporarily, staying with a friend while we began the process of dividing our assets. Friends and family started reaching out, some offering support, others prying for details. I kept my responses vague, not wanting to drag them into the mess. Through it all, I felt a strange sense of relief. The pain of Sarah's betrayal hadn't faded, but the weight of pretending everything was fine had lifted. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Divorce was messy, painful, and full of uncertainties. But as difficult as it was, I also knew it was the right choice. There was no going back now, and in some ways, that realization gave me the strength to keep moving forward. The days following Sarah's departure felt surreal. The house, once filled with shared routines and small, familiar comforts, now echoed with an emptiness I couldn't escape. Her absence was a constant reminder of how drastically life had changed, but it was also a relief. I no longer had to navigate the tense silences or the painful pretense of normalcy. Despite the relief, the weight of the divorce process loomed over me. The lawyer's calls, the endless paperwork, and the discussions about dividing our life into neat, separate piles were exhausting. Each signature felt like a nail in the coffin of the 12 years we'd spent building a life together. Sarah tried to reach out a few times during those early days, mostly through text messages. "I'm sorry for everything. I know I messed up, but I still care about you. Can we just talk? One last time?" I ignored most of them. What was left to say? She'd made her choices, and I was done paying the price for them. But the fallout wasn't limited to just us. Word of our separation spread quickly, as it always does in close-knit social circles. Friends started calling, some offering support, others fishing for gossip. I kept my explanations brief: things didn't work out. It's for the best. Not everyone was satisfied with that. Mutual friends wanted to know who was at fault, who had hurt whom, and why. Sarah's betrayal eventually surfaced, whether through whispers or her own admission, I wasn't sure, and the reactions were mixed. Some people sided with me, expressing shock and anger on my behalf. Others, particularly those closer to Sarah, tried to justify her actions. "She must have been unhappy," they'd say. "You know how stressful her job is." Hearing those excuses made my blood boil. Stress didn't justify betrayal. Unhappiness didn't excuse lying. But I bit my tongue, not wanting to get dragged into arguments I had no energy for. The hardest part of the fallout was confronting the memories. Everywhere I looked in the house, I saw pieces of the life we'd shared, photos of vacations, furniture we'd picked out together, and the small mementos we'd collected over the years. Each one felt like a reminder of what I'd lost, of the trust that had been shattered. One evening, while sorting through some old boxes in the attic, I found a stack of letters Sarah had written to me during our early years together. They were filled with declarations of love, promises of a future we'd build side by side. Reading them felt like a punch to the gut. I wanted to throw them away, to rid myself of anything that tied me to her, but I couldn't. Instead, I tucked them back into the box and shoved it into a corner, out of sight but not entirely forgotten. Meanwhile, Sarah's life seemed to unravel further. Her friend, who had initially offered her a place to stay, began distancing herself. Rumors circulated about the affair, and it became clear that the man she'd been involved with wasn't sticking around. Whether he'd lost interest or realized the mess he'd contributed to, I didn't know, but the fallout for Sarah was undeniable. Her work suffered, too. A few of her real estate clients, who'd heard whispers of the affair, dropped her as their agent. She reached out to me once, tearfully admitting that she was struggling, but I couldn't bring myself to care. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. As for me, I began to find strength in small victories. I started focusing on my work, pouring myself into projects that reminded me of my capabilities and value. I leaned on a few close friends, who offered steady support without prying. And slowly, I began to imagine a life beyond the wreckage of our marriage, a life where I wasn't defined by Sarah's betrayal, but by how I chose to move forward. The path ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. The first steps toward rebuilding my life felt shaky at best, but they were steps nonetheless. I started with small changes, things that reminded me I was still in control of my future. I rearranged the furniture in the house, replacing pieces Sarah had picked out with ones that felt more like me. I took down the framed photos of us that had lined the walls and stored them in the attic, creating space for something new. But it wasn't just about the physical changes. The mental and emotional work was far more challenging. For so long, I defined myself as part of a partnership, as Sarah's husband. Now, I had to figure out who I was on my own. Work became a lifeline during those early weeks. As a software engineer, I thrived on solving complex problems, and diving into projects helped me focus on something other than the turmoil in my personal life. My boss, who knew I was going through a divorce, offered me a flexible schedule, which allowed me to take long lunch breaks or leave early when the weight of it all became too much. I also reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years. It was humbling to reach out, to admit that I needed company and support, but the response was overwhelmingly positive. Old friends welcomed me back into their lives without judgment, and for the first time in years, I started to feel like myself again. One weekend, a friend invited me to join a hiking group. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't exactly the outdoorsy type, but something about the idea appealed to me. Being surrounded by nature, away from screens and reminders of Sarah, felt like a chance to reset. The hike was harder than I expected, but as I stood at the summit, looking out over miles of rolling hills and open sky, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in months. The world was still vast, still full of possibilities, and my life was just one small part of it. In the evenings, I started journaling, a habit I'd picked up during counseling. Writing helped me process my emotions, turning the tangled mess of thoughts in my head into something coherent. I wrote about my anger, my sadness, and even my moments of hope. Sarah's texts grew less frequent as time went on. She seemed to accept that I wasn't going to respond, and the space between us grew wider. I heard through mutual friends that she was struggling, both personally and professionally, but I didn't reach out. My focus was on my own healing, not hers. One day, I found myself scrolling through my phone, deleting old photos and messages. As I hovered over a picture of us from a vacation years ago, I hesitated. The memory was a happy one, but it felt tainted now, overshadowed by everything that had come after. I didn't delete it. Instead, I moved it to a folder labeled Past. It felt symbolic, an acknowledgement that the life I'd shared with Sarah was over, but not something I needed to erase completely. Gradually, the pain of her betrayal began to fade. It didn't disappear entirely. I wasn't naive enough to think it ever would, but it no longer consumed me. The trust I'd lost, the hurt I'd felt, became part of my story, not the defining chapter. One evening, as I sat on the couch with a glass of wine, watching a movie, I realized I felt content. It wasn't the overwhelming happiness I'd once imagined for myself, but it was enough. I was building a new life, one step at a time, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving in the right direction. This new version of my life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And that was more than enough. Sitting here now, months removed from the chaos of my marriage unraveling, I can finally reflect on everything that happened with a sense of clarity. The pain of Sarah's betrayal, the anger, the humiliation, it all feels like a scar now. It doesn't hurt the way it used to, but it's a part of me, a reminder of what I've been through and how far I've come. Looking back, it's almost hard to recognize the person I was during those dark days. I was consumed by disbelief, caught in a storm of emotions I didn't know how to navigate. But somehow, I made it through. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that trust is the foundation of any relationship. Without it, even the strongest connections will crumble. Sarah and I built a life together on what I thought was mutual trust, but when that trust was broken, there was no going back. The cameras, ironically enough, were never meant to be part of our story. I installed them for safety, for peace of mind, not realizing they'd become the silent witnesses to the unraveling of my marriage. Sometimes, I wonder if ignorance would have been bliss, if I would have been better off not knowing. But deep down, I know the truth. Knowing, painful as it was, set me free. It forced me to confront the reality of my situation and make a choice, to stay and suffer in a broken relationship or to walk away and rebuild. Walking away wasn't easy. It meant letting go of a life I'd spent over a decade building. But it also meant choosing myself, choosing to heal, and choosing to believe that there was life beyond betrayal. Now, I focus on the things I can control. My career, my friendships, my hobbies, all the parts of my life that bring me fulfillment and remind me of my worth. I've even started to think about dating again, though I know I'll carry the lessons of my past into any future relationships. To anyone who might be reading this and going through something similar, I offer this: healing takes time. It's messy, painful, and anything but linear. But it's possible. The pain won't last forever, and with time, you'll find strength in yourself you didn't know you had. As for Sarah, I don't harbor anger toward her anymore. What she did was unforgivable, but holding on to resentment would only hurt me in the end. I hope she finds whatever she was searching for, though I'm grateful it's no longer at my expense. My life now is quieter, simpler, and smaller in some ways, but it's honest. And that honesty, that freedom to be at peace with myself, is worth more than I ever thought possible. This isn't the ending I envisioned when I stood at the altar 12 years ago, but it's an ending nonetheless, and perhaps, more importantly, it's a new beginning.